Welcome to the NYU Game Center lecture series, and tonight's guest, Cara Ellison. We're very excited to have her. Before we begin, just a couple of announcements. As always, I want to thank the generous sponsors who make the Game Center lecture series possible: Avalanche, Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, We Play Dots, and Gigantic Mechanic. Thank you very much to those people. I also want to mention we're just finishing up another event, which is pretty exciting, which is the launch of a fantastic iOS game called Sunburn, which was made by some recent graduates of the NYU Game Center MFA program. And you should definitely check that out if you want to get a taste of the awesome games that we're making. So go to playsunburn.com and learn more about that. So tonight's guest, Cara Ellison, is a writer and a critic, someone who has written for The Guardian and New Statesman, for Rock Paper Shotgun, Eurogamer, Kotaku, and numerous other sites. Writes about games and game culture, and recently has done something very interesting and a kind of experiment in writing about games, where she crowdfunded a project which involves traveling around the world and spending time with the people who make games and learning about their creative process, learning about their lives, learning about the world that they live in. I think that in many ways there's a kind of what Cara is doing is bearing witness to a fundamental change that's taking place in games and game culture, in which there is a new interest in and awareness of games as a connection between people, the people who make them and the people who play them, and what that means. So I think in some ways, Cara is a kind of a deeply humanist writer, right? Who's really interested in people more than technology, and that's one of the things that makes her work so important. So we're going to hear from Cara tell us some of the stories, some of the insights she's gained in this, and the experiences she's had, and then have a conversation with her about her point of view. So please join me in welcoming Cara Ellison.
Hello, I'm super excited to be here. Can you hear me? Does everyone hear me? Okay. A little bit louder, I guess. Can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. All right. So can I just have a show of hands? Do you all have you read the Embed with stuff, or are we mostly strangers? Okay, a few people. Okay, that's fine. All right. So I'm just going to start off right at the beginning. So it's 3 years ago, and I'm in Clint Hawking's house at a party. I am dimly aware that Clint Hawking made the good Splinter Cells and Far Cry 2, a critically polarizing game that cool people I don't understand like. I haven't written anything about video games in my career yet, and so though I work for the BBC, I'm effectively invisible in games crowds. And Clint Hawking has no idea who I am, and he flashes me a sort of weird, like, why the fuck are you here, glance across the room. And I'm currently in polite conversation with a man called Martin Hollis, who is English and soft-spoken and has a gentle manner that I quite like. So Martin Hollis was the lead designer on GoldenEye 007, which was a groundbreaking first-person shooter game that defined most of my senior years of secondary school. And it was on the N64, which is actually, incidentally, my favorite console. Essentially, Martin is the author of many of my fondest memories, psychologically torturing my younger brother. Here he is. He's way too nice for that, but yeah, he did invent the amazing FPS genre, really. So my heart suddenly beats a little bit faster because I suddenly realize that Martin Hollis isn't a god, he's just a man. Right? And so sometime after this, at a time where I count myself a friend of Martin's, and when Clint Hawking has followed me on Twitter, guys, which I count a significant win, Martin Hollis gave a talk at the Game Developers Conference Europe, where he explained that the reason he was given the job on GoldenEye 007 at Rare was because he demonstrated an obsession with James Bond. So Martin shows a little video he made at like about 10 years old doing the classic shooting pose like that, and then the blood running down the screen. And he did that when he was very, very young. So GoldenEye 007 is a critically acclaimed video game, the best James Bond game. It is often cited, but it definitely is. But at this moment, I know that GoldenEye 007 has become an organic part of me as a critic. How I understand the first-person shooter game or genre is tied up in my first moments of GoldenEye. And I can hear the watch menu music in my head if I think about it right now. You know that bit where and it makes me feel like I'm right there again, feeling like the coolest person alive. So as I watch Martin's GoldenEye talk, I wonder for the first time if groundbreaking video games come directly from a deep cultural root inside a developer. I wonder if they come from a desire to understand and interrogate the culture around them. Not only do our best developers interrogate previous game systems, but they investigate and interpret the world around them through game systems. A little seedling of an idea happens in my brain, and I ignore it. 3 years later, I am very poor. I am drunk on post-Christmas Prosecco, and I am staying in my friend's spare room in Edinburgh, Scotland. The games company I worked for has closed, and I rely solely on writing features about video games to pay my rent, which is an absurd existence. I open up a page on Patreon and create an account. This is as it sits now. I'm really sorry about the photograph. It's really quite ridiculous. So Patreon is an online service for creators where people can endow patronage on artists, writers, and any other kind of creator, giving a monthly donation of their choice to the creator of their choice. I find myself writing a manifesto about my silly outlook on writing and what kind of writing I'll put up monthly if my readers want to help me pay a little bit of my rent. But then I go way off the rails. The tipsy part of my brain starts to reel. I get incredibly overexcited. I think I'm listening to Kanye or something. Part of the manifesto goes, if I get to $1,000 per article, I'll do what I always threaten to do. I will do embedded game journalism. I will give up my nice, comfortable cottage rental in Brighton and use the money to journey to the most exciting authors of the medium. Stay with them, explore their outlook, ask how their environment affects their design. This is a thing that game journalism usually cannot afford to pay the travel for or the time for, and so we don't get this in-depth content. Or perhaps it is that no one is actually interested in this, but I am. I proceed to give a list of people I'd be interested in covering, and I put the Patreon page up and tweet about it. It's a dark, gross, cold shave Sunday night in January, and I don't think anyone will pay attention. I sit under the covers and I watch Twitter. 2 hours later, the subscribers have given me way over $1,000, and I am fully freaking out, panicking, jamming my face full of biscuits and cake. I contact my flatmate in Brighton and I explain that I am moving out. I'm like, look, I did this thing on the internet, and oh shit, oh god, I'm moving out, and meanwhile the money is going up again. I'm completely afraid of my own audacity. What if I can't deliver it? What if everyone unsubscribes after a month because I'm a shitty writer, not even slightly up to the task? What if everyone just thought I was begging some embarrassment to the games community, if you can call it that? What if no developer said yes to my visiting? What if I was just putting myself out of a home for no reason? Worse, what if everyone called me pretentious? People had a lot to say about me. People really got on the Patreon hatred campaign. They rightly recognized that a lot of the money I was given depended on my visibility as a writer, and this in turn depended on my ability to be published in all the places across the internet I had been able to bust through the gates of. But the thing is, I'd kicked down those gates myself to reach those people. I'd compromised and written previews of games which I openly hated in order to be heard. There are lots of things you have to do if you want to make writing a job and not a fancy. But eventually I realized people were paying to sustain my voice, and they didn't care how I did it, but they wanted to read what I was writing. So I packed 2 bags and gave the rest of my possessions away to charity, made 20 fiery playlists full of churches and sleigh bells, and I left home trying not to think about failure. This is Edinburgh. This is where I come from. I miss it quite a bit, but it's freezing right now, so I don't want to be there. We spent our childhoods being told by many games enthusiast publications that games should be for the player, should serve the player, are for us, for we the consumer, the people. They are toys for grown-ups, and we snatch them greedily from their makers. Games journalists in the 90s, too, enthusiastically embraced the idea that they were consumers, and they just wanted to buy all the shit that was marketed to them. But the problem with that is marketing seemed, and still seems, awfully in tune with what the consumer wants. It's almost like they have a handle on telling them what they want. It's like they can shape it. And that has slowly made many publisher-backed developers slaves to marketing and crunch time, long hours floated on their love of the medium, but never seeing their families. And it wasn't always like this. Perhaps one of the most beautiful things about knowing I am Scottish is that bedroom coding was a strong and secret trade in my home country when I was a child. Though I had no idea at the time, I was surrounded by people like Leslie Benzies, who was programming away in his bedroom in Aberdeenshire and who would later be one of the progenitors of Grand Theft Auto. Leslie would later become my boss at Rockstar Games, and I'd work in an office with John White and others who had worked on Lemmings when they just started out. I think of my childhood in Scotland as like being surrounded by people who practiced their magic in secret before we knew developers could even be gods. The bedroom coders didn't have a player base. They had no company or stakeholders. They made games for the pure pleasure of it. They wanted to experiment. They wanted to express themselves in that Wild West. They wanted to make for the pleasure of making. Though later Grand Theft Auto would become one of the biggest franchises in the world, helping strap down the hold big commercial sequels had on gamers, it came from one original beautiful little break for expression from struggling boy programmers. Games like Chucky Egg, Dig Dug, Hover Bover, all these games that I played when I was young were all made by young people in their bedrooms, armed only by their own fascination and an idle hour. But 3 years ago, I wasn't aware that this was the case. I thought it had always been this way, that to quote Matthew Burns, the player was the consumer king, and developers were merely the consumer king's unfortunate children. The bedroom coders of the 80s lived in an era where the internet wasn't the distribution platform it is now, a place where anyone can log in, a place where anyone can distribute. My mind was completely changed. You might recognize that guy there too, and that's Anna Anthropy, who's a wonderful lady. My mind was completely changed when I met Anna Anthropy. Anna had decided to live a life putting out games like psychedelic self-illustrated zines. Though Anna had studied at the Guildhall for a time, she shunned the big game engines, and she chose to make her games in free tools like Gamemaker Studio and Twine, a text game engine. Anna was rock and roll. She was punk and outrage and riot girl. She singed my brain. In one interview, my first interview, she told me, "I think that games sort of need to be saved from themselves. Games are really exciting and interesting to me as a form, and I think it's really sad that they're being used to do so little and to represent such a small set of values and perspectives. I want games to be more personal. I want games to actually tell us something about the author and the people who make them. Part of that is I want more people who have something to tell us about themselves to make games. I try to be present in all of my games. I try to have all of my games point back to me and say something about me." Anna was right. Anna predicted and helped to instigate one of the biggest cultural movements to have developers take back games big time. When I started out to write what I call the Embed with Games series, I didn't know what questions I'd ask or what would become important. People often ask me how I choose the people I cover, and it's a complex answer. It's heavily slanted towards my own biases. I choose people I'm interested in who are doing something new or weird. I choose people I trust in my personal space. I choose diverse people. It's often haphazard. In Asia, I often landed in a place with only a trusted contact to pick me up and had to seek out people to cover. The only 2 rules are that I don't sign any NDAs because no one gets to bind what I say, and white men only get to be a small section of who I cover. Money and time also limited everything I did this year. I thought by staying with a generation of independent game makers, I'd just be documenting life in a new way. I thought their outlook would change my mind about something, or perhaps disabuse me of the notion that games are only interested in violence. And it turns out most of the games I ended up covering are non-violent or critique violent systems, which wasn't actually deliberate. Perhaps a lot of the games new creators are making are finally disinterested in systems of violence. But a pattern did show itself eventually. Let me take you through a few of the amazing figures from my writing. So the first person I covered was George Buckingham. So George is actually a friend of mine from way back, and George lives in a flat with my other friend Alice, who now writes news at Rock, Paper, Shotgun. But yeah, I was trying to do a warm-up, so I did actually just cover my friends, so that was kind of just a test to see if I could do it. So the first up while I gathered my bearings was George Buckingham and Alice O'Connor, who helped run the London game event, The Wild Rumpus. Both unconventional game makers. George is working with Die Gute Fabrik on an atmospheric, adventure-like game, Mutazione. And Alice, who is my friend and a journalist for Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and he run game nights every few months with the help of the rest of the Wild Rumpus team. So Wild Rumpus is heavily focused on performativity and spectatorship in games, the idea that the player performs the games they are playing, and this is valuable as a community activity. I wrote this about George at the time. I get the very strong feeling that games serve George. He makes them serve his own curiosities and then puts them in the world to observe how people interact with them. This is probably why his work is so often unconventional. George developed a game last year called Punch the Custard, where you get 2 bowls of custard hooked up to a circuit, and 2 players literally just punch into the bowl of custard over and over to see which person can do it fastest. George is heavily interested in HCI, human-computer interaction. He's interested in what computers do to us. During that January, George and Alice had nowhere for me to stay, so I had to share Alice's single bed with her every night. Often we would talk very late into the night about identity and belonging, how to make things that serve you. This is what I wrote about Alice. This is the only place that has ever felt like home to her. She used to sleep in a room that was a throughway for the rest of her family, no door, feeling like she was intruding on other spaces constantly. This is the only space where she's felt like she belonged, where she is now creating things that make her happy. She told me that she loves feeling useful in a practical way. Writing video game news on the intangible internet for 5 years has made her crave physically helping others. She is excited by the prospect of being needed and of making things. I lay transfixed by the wall and her body, my own smile and her happiness, hugging myself. In London, I also came across Holly Gramazio, who opened practice here at NYU a week ago. I wrote about Holly. Holly Gramazio, someone with more experience with real-world games, analog games, tells me that she thinks of what action she wants the players to perform and works backwards. She is the opposite of George. She thinks of an enjoyable or silly performance or spectacle and reverse engineers it. George makes something experimental to almost record what sort of reaction is made. But Holly knows the outcome and structures her games appropriately. In February, Carla Zamanja from the Fulbright Company came to the north of England, and I traveled around with her for weeks, getting sleepy in the rough English weather. Carla is naturally a quiet, thoughtful, and delightfully sarcastic person. She took a while to really open up. She took a little while, but eventually, we were sat in a diner in London, moping around, talking about her colleague, Steve Gaynor. I wrote, "Gone Home developer Carla Zamanja is yelling at me over a glass of rosé wine in a woozy backstreet diner, the kind where everyone spits their late-night accounting frustrations over food so greasy they stain wooden tables. Steve doesn't have an agenda," she says on half sleep. "I have a fucking agenda. I want to help even out some of the inequality." I can't remember if she hit the table then, but if she didn't, let's say that she did. But I sat there thinking I was witnessing the terrible and the wonderful. I have a fucking agenda. It felt like she'd reached into my body and plucked out a giant sticky ball of elastic bands from my body, and with it all the tension of the past few years. I have a fucking agenda, I said silently over and over to myself. I have a fucking agenda. Everyone has a fucking agenda. I couldn't believe she said it so readily. These are the sorts of things we whisper in our sleep, but never consciously, where people can hear. It was odd to hear, you know? Like, it was odd to hear developers say that they wanted to transmit themselves like that. Everyone at Rockstar Games used to talk about what the player wanted all the time, enabling the player, making the player powerful. I didn't really understand before this that game makers could shape a culture or would want to shape a culture. I think this is when I knew that Embed With wasn't going to be a failure. I think I knew that I could hold it down then. I think I knew I could get some sort of meaning from it. Let's talk about Tim Rogers for a while. That's Tim in the middle. He's whispering to Batman. I don't really know what he's saying, but I like to think that it's, you're a jerk, or something. I don't know. And that's when my hair was red, which I kind of like it, actually. Maybe I should go back to that. But anyway, we need to talk about Tim Rogers. I met Tim sometime in 2009 before he was kicked out of Tokyo, at a time where he existed as a pure internet entity that was somehow writing for Kotaku. At that time, Tim was already an internet legend, some sort of internet rumor that analyzed games so sharply and wrote essays so rambling and emotive that people would somehow turn up at his doorstep in Tokyo to pay homage to him. Almost every semi-famous tech writer that I know has made the pilgrimage to Tim and had some sort of profound experience living in his strange world. My friend, the writer Patrick Miller, describes Tim as a social network. I still have no idea where I decided to go and see Tim all the way from my home in Kyushu because I was living in Japan at the time. But I did, and we had dinner, and Tim mostly talked about making a Doctor Who video game. By the time I left Tokyo, I still wasn't sure who Tim was or what he actually did. I visited Tim in California this year to write about him in March, and I am still not really sure who Tim is or what he actually does. So this is Oakland. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that Tim likes to be in control of things. Looking back on what I wrote about visiting Tim, who was making a video game called Video Ball that was meant to be out months ago, by the way, it seems as if Video Ball is a game where control, the closeness of the player to their avatar, is of the utmost importance. Video Ball is a sports game, something that requires intense player skill and awareness of environment. And the more I think about Video Ball, the more I think that Tim is making a game that is almost like himself. In March, Tim's friend Starbaby drove us up into the Oakland Hills late at night, the car winding up and up. We were playing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 Turtles in Time soundtrack loud and laughing even though none of us were drunk. Let me see. I wrote, Tim and I are thrown around in the back with no seatbelts on like bottle tops in the bowels of a corkscrewing ship. Tim holding onto the umbilical cord of the wire that sends music from his iPhone to the car's sound system. He flaps it around. This is how I like to think about games, he says, indicating the new track he is feeding the speakers, waggling the line, the dash responding to his touch. Starbaby smacks the wheel. You should write that down, he yells at me, and I laugh. So I did write it down. This is Liz Ryerson. Control is one thing, but the pattern knitted through all the Embed Withs is in the power of expression. Liz Ryerson sees games as teaching tools, something that can demonstrate or intimate the difficulty of traversing worlds. She said to me, if you're trying to teach something by telling them something or writing it down, then that's one thing. But if you're making a game to try and teach something and you put in text or you put in something explicit, you take something out of that experience. And Nina, who's here in New York, in a similar way, told me that games are an important way of expressing herself and receiving validation in a way she is comfortable with. The most rewarding way for me to explore that is unfortunately by having other people talk with me about it or having the awareness that other people are engaging with it. Because then I am getting the sense of not being totally alone. My parents made me feel alone by brushing off everything that I was doing. Seeing people interact with things I make, actually play it, feels like they are actively engaged with what I'm trying to say. Girls are always told that they're crazy or that their emotions aren't real, Nina says. They'll be like, oh, you're just saying that, or whatever. People have always said that to me. I feel like maybe games are like, no, Fuck you. I'm not crazy. This shit is real. So in Malaysia, I asked Sean Beck who he makes games for. It's mostly for myself, Sean says, immediately and definitely. In France, when I visited the developers Catherine Neal and Harvey Smith, it became obvious that the French outlook to culture is encouraging and supportive to artists and creators. Harvey Smith, known creator of Deus Ex, who is originally from the Gulf Coast, told me, the US makes it very easy to start businesses if you already have access to funds and all. If you do really well, you keep all of the money. But on the other hand, the safety net and the things that people in the US see as a fundamental right are limited. It can be frustrating. I look at this like a game designer. If you looked at all the levers that you have in terms of GDP, you could tweak it so that off the very high end, you take some money and put it on the low end so that everybody has a base subsistence. If you get sick, you're taken care of. And if you're elderly, you're taken care of. Or you have a year of maternity leave. Things like that stabilize the society. It enables people to take more risks. I'm living in France right now, and I'm working with a guy who took a few years off to be an actor, and eventually he ended up in video games. Now he draws from both of those fields. In France, it seemed to me that joy was a fundamental right, like shelter, food, and safety. But the real truth is that though France invests in culture, it makes artists' lives easier and more comfortable, and people will create things no matter what. Cut to me sitting in a tiny Tokyo cubicle bar with the maker of the Stanley Parable, Davy Reedon. We are talking about internet harassment, awful people of the internet. We're talking about how the atmosphere online has become hostile towards creators, particularly women creators. I say I am thinking about leaving. I am not sure I want to write or create in this environment. I'm grumpy as hell and whining about it. Why should we make things for awful people? I say to Davy over the noise. Davy shakes his head at me. I can't stop making things, ever, he says. I just have to make. I just have to make things. I don't care who it's for. The internet has done a lot of things for us as creators. It's made our smallest projects able to reach others. It's made tools to make games easily distributable. Kind people offer resources for free to let us express ourselves. But what it's done for game makers is truly enable them to make games for themselves and also be able to sell and survive on those games. Brendan Chung, for example, is making the very cinema-inspired heist game Quadrilateral Cowboy. Here's like a video. It didn't come in 2013. It's a good picture of him. It's like he's just saying to me, "What are you doing, Cara? Why are you here?" Talking to Brendan Chung when I was in LA, I was struck by how optimistic and how excited he was about the future of games. For me, it's not about where video games are right now, he says. More like what we could do with video games. We play these games right now and they do things, but it's that feeling. We're at that stage in film where you just see the train coming towards you and people are freaking out because they think they're going to get run over by the train. Just thinking about where we're going to be in 20 years, games are going to be freaking crazy. There's something about that that is really exciting. The last time I see Davy Reedon We were drunk backstage at Tokyo Sea Punk gig for some reason, and Davey tells me he's ready to leave the concert. I got what I wanted from this experience, he says to me. I got what I wanted. And I think we're on the brink of everyone getting what they want. Thank you. I promised everyone that I would play this song. I did actually promise everyone I'd play this song because it's from Hackers.
That was lovely, thank you. Yeah, you can leave that playing.
Oh, yeah?
Leave it playing part of it.
Okay. Should I keep the mic on?
Yes, bring your microphone over, and we're gonna open it up to the audience for Q&A, but before we do that, I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
And that was a lovely talk, thank you. Yeah. Beautiful. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was scenes. Because you talk a lot about individuals, and you are spending time with these wonderful, diverse set of, kind of intense personalities. But I'm curious, as you travel around the world and you visit these different community games, whether you get a sense of the communities that they're a part of, and whether that's also a big aspect of the games that they're making. Thank you, Gwenna.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It is a big aspect of things. Like, I was really interested with that aspect when I was with Liz Ryerson, because the primary thing that was coming out of what she was saying to me, so I tend to try and get a feel for what people want to say to me rather than me trying to, I try not to let my bias in what's happening around me actually sort of imprint on them too much. It's unavoidable most of the time, but so I think what Liz Ryerson was saying to me was that she felt very strongly that she would never have started making games if she wasn't surrounded by people who are making games. So she lived with Anna Anthropy for a while, and because Anna was just constantly making games, she just felt like, I could do that. I could make a game. Anyone can make a game, right? I could do that. So she did make a game, and she is actually a very talented composer and musician as well. And so she started doing soundtracks in earnest for games and digital art too. And I feel like that story was more about community than the rest. But also recently I went to Tokyo and covered a game maker called Ojiro Fumoto. And Ojiro, I found him at a newly begun Tokyo Indies meet. And they're just starting up a kind of indie scene there just now. And it's really interesting because for a really long time, most bedroom coders, let's say, in Japan, were associated with the doujin community. And the doujin community is purely a kind of fan service community where they'll take known properties and then make games out of really popular characters, say. And it's usually not for commercial. No one usually sells anything. It's just a fan activity. But some big games have come out of it. But it's quite small and it's non-commercial usually. And so now there's this kind of imported Western idea of indie games. And so that's starting to become more mainstream now in Japan, which means that more Japanese people are actually making games for distribution in the West as well as in Japan. So it's really interesting. So I covered Ojiro recently, and I feel like he gets support from the community that wouldn't be there otherwise. So that's really interesting as well. I feel like community is incredibly important.
I mean, it's a huge part of us, what we do at the Game Center. We think that that's so much of what learning about games and making games is about is being part of an environment, other people, where you know that you have people that are kind of they're kind of obliged to pay attention to what you're doing, to look at your work.
Yeah.
You know they're going to give you feedback.
Yeah.
So as you're making something, you have them in mind to a certain degree. They're not always going to like it, but they're gonna pay attention to it, and that so much of what you end up doing becomes part of this kind of unraveling conversation about games.
That's it.
You know what I'm saying? So did you pick up, like, does that conversation have a different tone in different cities? Is it
does.
different in Paris than it is in
Oh yeah,
Austin?
so like it's very fragmented in Paris. Like actually they have a few indie game makers dotted across France, but they don't usually socialize together and they don't problem solve together. What I thought was really amazing particularly about Oakland and New York, is that actually everyone tends to share ideas, and like everyone tends to be like, okay, why don't we just like talk about this for a while and eventually we'll solve this problem.
Share is a nice way to put it.
Yeah,
I think,
sharing.
what we do with our ideas.
Sharing.
Yeah.
But in Malaysia, like I asked, like what is the community, and in Singapore too, I was like, does the community come together to socialize? And everyone was like, yeah, of course. I was like, do you tend to show your work and like show prototypes and show early builds and like try and problem solve together? And everyone's like, actually, we've still not got over this idea that people might steal our stuff, like steal our ideas. And I'm sure here in the US people do steal each other's ideas, but I think that people sacrifice that for a kind of feeling of community sometimes. And a lot of it is actually like trust, or, I mean, I'm sure there's been times where it's gone wrong, but I think especially in the US and to a certain extent London as well, like people are actually quite happy to problem solve together, whereas like everyone in Malaysia wasn't quite sure whether they wanted to do that yet. But yeah, like that's been my feeling at least. And I think actually I was in Amsterdam as well, and in Amsterdam the community is incredibly close to such an extent that they all work in this giant building called the Dutch Game Garden, and everyone's like right next to each other all the time. So I'm pretty sure that they share all of their ideas too.
Nice. One thing I wanted to ask you about is economics, right?
Yes.
The materialist substructure
Yes.
underneath culture, the thing that sort of is churning away against. Because a big part of your story is economics, is crowdsourcing, which kind of opened up, like you had been making money writing as doing criticism and journalism. It's a hard way to make money, trying to do smart independent writing. You had tried this idea of like, I wonder if I could get people to pay me to do this thing that I really want to do, and it turned out that they will. And then in the indie game scene itself, of course, has sort of been made possible by new ways of distributing games, by new ways of making money from games. So I guess, I'm just curious about how that, what you've encountered of money in economics.
It's really funny because I try not to Mary Sue myself too much, but like every single person that I visited, I ended up identifying with them so hard. I was like, oh man, like all of your problems are the same problems I have all the time.
Transference.
Exactly. So I had like a lot of like, like there were a lot of people who were like, I wonder if I could kickstart this game, or I wonder if I could, I wonder if anyone on the internet would help me out. And like, actually, I went around the world pretty much just like spreading the idea of Patreon to game makers. And they're like, I can make a game a month, and then like get like whatever it is you get, like $2,000. That sounds amazing, So they were pretty into that idea, yeah. So, but yeah, so like there is that, but there's also like, the economics of writing about games is, well, there isn't any, to be honest. You can't really survive doing it unless you've got like a salaried job, and even then it's not really that well paid. And you have to do this thing, which I hate, which is called writing news, which I'm not really into. I don't like writing about like new stuff that's coming out. I just think it's really boring. So you can't really, if you have an interest in writing games features, just like, profound words about the greatest games of all time, then you probably can't survive just doing that. You probably have to get another job and do it on the side. So I think I was just very stubborn. And I'm pretty sure Kotaku at one point offered me a job, and I said no, and I shouldn't have done that because then I lost my job in development. And I was like, damn.
What was your job in development? You mentioned working for Rockstar.
Yeah.
That's kind of the dream of many a young game designer.
Yeah.
And what was that like? How did that happen?
So when I left university with an English literature degree, which is, wow.
Yeah.
You don't want one of those are not the ones to get. Don't get that one. So I got an English literature degree, and I didn't know what to do with it. I thought I was going to go into publishing, and so I did actually work in publishing for a while, but then I realized I probably had to shoot some old white dude to get jobs. So I
sitting right here. Security.
Security.
So I figured out that wasn't a place to go. So I applied to be a QA tester at Rockstar North,
Okay.
which is it's in Edinburgh, which is where I was living at the time. So if you like games at all and you live in Edinburgh, you're like, I'll just apply to Rockstar North. And sometimes you get in, and I don't know why they let me in, but they did. And probably because I had an English literature degree, and probably no one else. They were like, why has she applied? Like, she seems weird. Okay, let's have her. I tested GTA 4 for a year, and it was actually pretty rough because being a tester is like horrible. Like, it's actually not a great job. And lots of 14-year-old boys are like, oh my god, I so badly want that job. And I'm like, no, you really don't. I just throw like this main character into a wall for like 5 hours, and nothing usually happens. So I tested that game, and then the game came out, and then because I was contract, I left, and I always wanted to go and live in Japan, so I went to live in Japan for 2 years randomly, and I didn't want anything to do with video games ever again because I felt like AAA development is it's very hard. It's like one of those. It's one of those jobs where it's such a huge amount of people working on something that you never really get control over what you're specifically doing. And especially when you're a tester, like I had some limited input on the like creative side, but like it was mostly just like suggestions of how to improve things, or like asking the artist to make something or to replace something and that sort of thing. So
You mentioned a couple of the folks from Rockstar North, or DMA is what they call them.
Yeah.
But you didn't mention David Jones, and we have like a weird obsession. So Bennett Foddy and I.
With Dave Jones?
Yeah, like was he around at the time? For some reason, he's this mysterious figure.
So Dave Jones.
He would seem to be important there, and then he went on to do Crackdown.
Yeah.
And then he made the Hot Cops MMO. I forget what it's called. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Like, so it's kind of weird because I feel like that whole crowd fragmented and like hate each other now or something.
Really?
I'm not sure.
So what's the inside scoop?
I have no idea. I feel like they just don't get on. I don't know what it is, but like I feel like there's just so little talk about Dave Jones.
Ooh.
So
It's so fascinating that Grand Theft Auto, like this icon of video game culture, and this like huge franchise has its, and this kind of, this sort of, in some ways, sort of the contemporary representation of New York City and America, has its roots in this beautiful, verdant hillside town, in Scotland. It's so interesting.
It is kind of weird. I mean, it's always like, so it's very strange actually. Every time I come to New York, so I spent a year, like in a darkened office, looking at a virtual representation of New York City when I hadn't been there.
Yeah.
And I felt like, so it was so intense to the extent that like, when I left the office, I would get confused as to which way the cars were going. Because they go down the left side in the UK and the right in Liberty City.
Yeah.
And I also had this huge urge to like try and start to just steal cars. Like I just was like, oh man, I'm so cold and I don't want to get the bus home. I should just steal this car. And the other thing that I used to do was when I was a tester on Grand Theft Auto 4, one of my jobs was to put bugs in when pedestrians in the game were behaving oddly. And so if you just leave the office and like someone on the walking down the pavement is doing something weird, you're like, oh my god, it's a bug. And in my brain, it would be like, oh my god, something's gone wrong in this like iteration of the build or something. And I just like, oh my god, something's gone wrong. So that was kind of it was such an intense job. And eventually I just realized I just didn't want to do it anymore. So I left. But the job I talk about leaving, I actually worked for a company called Little Loud, I think a year ago, or maybe it was 2 years ago now. No, a year ago? Can't remember. 2 years ago. And Little Loud are infamous now for making that game called Sweatshop, which was taken down from the App Store by Apple because, I guess, political reasons. Because essentially it was a game about like sweatshop ethics, like the idea that you're actually personally responsible if you're buying clothes from that were made in sweatshops. And it was basically it was funded by Channel 4, and it was basically to teach about how that might affect people. And it's like a top-down thing, and Simon Parkin was the game designer on it, and it's really, really, really fun. But they took it down. It's still available in Flash on playsweatshop.com, so you can still play it, and it's really, really good. But it's like one of those games where I guess it was kind of like the last disaster on the calendar that just shut us down. So our company closed, but I was a producer, an assistant producer there, and then I was writing part-time at the time. And then I guess I just had to write full-time after that because I didn't have anything else to do.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, you're a very good writer, and
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about your influences. Are there writers in other fields? Are there people that are writing about film or writing about music that you look up to or that you are inspired by?
So I feel a lot like I'm in a tradition of writers that were very sarcastic and writing about video games in the 90s. And they tended to write for a PC gaming magazine called PC Zone, which is a UK magazine, which is sadly now deceased, but it's like, it was, so my all-time favorite games writer is called Charlie Brooker. And Charlie Brooker now is quite a famous figure in the UK, but I do not believe he has made any headway in the US. But he is kind of like our Jon Stewart, and he writes this thing called Newswipe, but he also did a thing called Gameswipe as well because it sort of harks back to his roots. But like, he was like the main person I was reading when I was like 12 years old maybe, and he was like very sarcastic and kind of just very funny and acerbic, and he I guess like he was like a big influence on me, which is like really cool because last year I actually managed to write a documentary called How Video Games Changed the World with Charlie Brooker, who also presented it, and it was like really cool. So definitely check it out if you can. It's a really cool documentary about like some significant video games
Nice.
in the world. So yeah, it was cool.
Has your take on games changed over the course of the Embed project? Have you found yourself kind of, is it evolved? Has it caused you to change any of your opinions or attitudes?
Yeah, I mean, so I feel a lot like for the longest time I was very tired of the big AAA violent games. And I guess because I was so tired of seeing the same systems sort of cannibalize themselves over and over again, and sequels and sequels and sequels, I stopped playing them. But now, like, so what has happened over the course of this year is I basically go to live with these developers, but they pretty much like on their off time, most of the time, these developers would be playing these big AAA games, even though they're making these tiny non-violent games that are completely, you know, about loving someone or something, you know, like, but they're like, they would go away and play Far Cry or something, and I'd just be like, this is great because it kind of teaches you that, like, so even if you do have a particular taste in something, there's always room to have a diverse taste in games. There's always room to like experiment and look at what things are doing differently, and like, you know, like Steve Gaynor, who made Gone Home, is like the most, you know, subversive game of all time or something, or you think so these days, I don't know, but like he made Gone Home, but then he came from BioShock, and like he made all these like video games that are primarily about, you know, offing someone in a spectacular way, you know what I mean? So it's like, all of these things coexist with each other, and it's really nice that they do. Like, I really like hyper-violent games, but I also really like video games where you love each other, you know?
I think about this a lot, actually, because for me, it's an important part of the way I think about these things, that there is something that ties these different kinds of games together. And it's an important part about how we approach the subject at the Game Center when we teach about games. You know, we teach about video games within the larger context of games as an ancient form of culture that goes back, board games, sports, party games, social games. And I think of you know, World of Warcraft and golf as having a lot in common.
Yeah.
And sometimes I worry that I'm struggling too hard to hold these things together, right? And sometimes, you know, I think that there's a sense in which some people, like the Tale of Tales folks that I think you spent some time with, who make these beautiful art games, could care less about games of conflict and competition, and I think they're interested in using the technology of games and the techniques of games to create something brand new, and they don't, they have this idea of the not game, and they don't really care whether it's a game or not, whether it has any of those, those qualities. Whereas for me, I see this thread that ties them all together, and now I think we're seeing that, as games become more expansive, there's this cultural friction where people used to just have an identity that was, oh, I like games.
Yeah.
And now that they're large enough to contain different kinds of smaller communities, taste communities that are defining themselves against each other. It's not like, oh, no one says I love music, right? They say I love heavy metal, or they say I love disco. And if you love heavy metal, then disco sucks, you know what I mean? And so that's, like, we're experiencing that. And so, I don't know anymore. Sometimes I question, but it's nice to hear that the people who are making these delicate and expressive games are also finding a connection to
rampaging
these.
around killing people.
It's just like games where you shoot people. I think there's something like shooting people and loving people are the same. That's what I'm saying, Cara. Am I so wrong?
No.
Am I so wrong?
Shooting's a kind of loving.
It
No,
is.
I mean, let's not perpetuate that. No. But I feel like, I feel a lot like, so it's funny that you should mention Orion and Michael, because so Tale of Tales, it's really funny. I interviewed them for RPS for my column, which is called S.EXE, best named column in the entire universe, right?
It's a good name.
Solid name. It's a really good pun. I think actually someone gave it to me on Twitter. It wasn't my own work. But so anyway, it is now. So like, actually, I interviewed them in like traditional Cara fashion in a bar somewhere in Berlin or something, and they told me that on their wedding night, I just told this to Robert Young. On their wedding night, they got 2 huge bottles of champagne, and they went up to their expensive hotel room, and they just played Tekken 3 against each other.
Beautiful. Is that true?
That's true.
The
That's
greatest
absolutely
story I've ever
true.
heard.
Absolutely
That's
true.
such a cool
right?
story.
It's completely true, and they would be okay with me telling you this because I wrote this whole down for my column. And I was like, what? Like, it's your wedding night. Wouldn't you want to like? Like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they were like, no, like, you don't understand, Cara, like Tekken is highly erotic. Like, the characters touch each other and throw each other. And then eventually I was like, this is erotic for you. Like, this is a thing. And it was actually just, like, really nice to hear these 2 people who are so renowned for being, like, artsy and like everyone thinks they're stuck up, and they're not at all. They're just like, they have a particular taste in games and like making games, but like the games that they consume are just like whatever. I mean, Tekken. So like, it's one of those things where I was really surprised to hear, but also kind of like, I guess there's a certain kind of thing that we want to make, and it doesn't have to be the same sort of thing that you play. And like that's definitely something that I realized from like traveling around, is that people, like I feel like Ojiro Fumoto, for example, is making a Spelunky like type thing for mobile, which looks amazing, called Downwell. And of course he loves Spelunky, but like he's got like a whole hard drive full of like these Western games that he's completely obsessed with, and none of his games that he wants to make look anything like that. So so I mean, I think I got too used to that.
Are there games what are the games that you play that mean a lot to you as a player?
So I guess as a writer, I end up only these days playing games I have to play, which I know sounds really sad, but like for my column, I write S.EXE, which is about relationships and sex in video games, which is kind of a weird slice of the video game world. But like, I mainly just research for that and then try to find something interesting to say every 2 weeks. Which is actually becoming easier and easier and easier. Although last week someone sent me this lesbian sex game in 3D, and it's clearly not intended for lesbians. Because I took like
or 3-dimensional people.
Yeah. So I sent out a tweet on Twitter, and I said, hey, anyone in anyone in NYC who's a lesbian who likes video games and wants to help me review a lesbian sex game, would you like to come to the Museum of Sex with me in the bar and like play this video game? And I got like a flood of people. So they were like, okay. So then we concluded eventually that it wasn't really intended for lesbians, but it was very interesting. So that'll be going up probably tomorrow sometime, or Rock Paper Shotgun. But yeah, like I tend to just play video games that I want to write about. But having said that, I feel like probably the best video game I've played recently is Kentucky Route Zero.
Oh, nice.
Kentucky Route Zero is probably one of the most amazing experiences I've had playing a video game, I think.
Now you used to play Dota.
I
Is
did.
that true? Do you still play Dota? And is that something you've written about? And is that
Yes.
Yeah.
So like I started off my career writing about Dota. I actually like I think it's like either the first or second article I ever got paid for was a really long article. It was like an 8-pager in PC Gamer about my experiences playing Dota during university, which was mainly just me eating a lot of Skittles and playing Dota until 3 a.m. with all of my friends and being like, I actually feel like one of the worst human beings on the internet, because we all sat in IRC channels and just hurled abuse at each other. And so that was kind of like 4 years of my life, during which I didn't do any work. I was supposed to read like, you know, Byron and Coleridge and whatever, and I just essentially just wasn't doing that at all. And maybe my work would be better if I had actually read any of these books. But
you
yeah.
spend your time buying boots for anti-mage?
Exactly, like the Messerschmitt's Reaver. Like I was like, I'm gonna get Messerschmitt's, you guys, and everyone's like, don't you have like an essay to write? And I'm like, whatever. So yeah, that's what I used to do at university. But then I wrote this big 8-pager, and it was like the first thing that like anyone had ever tried to pay me for. Like I sent it to PC Gamer, and they didn't reply for a month. And I thought, they're not gonna want to publish this. And then they got back to me and they were like, have you sent this to anyone else? And I was like, what? And they were like, have you sent it to anyone else? And I was like, no. And they were like, we'll pay you £450 for it. And I was like, £450? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, you can make a lot of money from this shit, and actually you can't, but because I don't know if you know, if any of your writers, like you'll probably know that there's not an 8-page feature of PC Gamer in you like practically every month. It's just not there. Like it's like pulling out your soul or something. So yeah, so like that was like a one-off, but like that was how I got started. And I wrote like a MOBA column for RPS.
Really?
Which was ill-fated because I couldn't find enough time to write it eventually.
And also play.
And well, it's like MOBAs are super time-consuming because you basically have to immerse yourself in not only like all of the mechanics, which are like super intricate and massive and fold out like huge origami garlands or whatever, but they also have horrible communities in which like you're like submerging yourself in this kind of like caustic soup where like everyone is just horrible to each other all the time. And it was like super, like there's one MOBA, I can't remember what it was called, but there's this one MOBA that has like such a horrible community that I used to get drunk before logging in. And then like I would just play drunk and I'd just be like, yeah, fuck you buddy, fuck you, fuck you. And then I write this article and John Walker every month was like, Cara, what have you done? And I was like, oh man. So yeah, it was kind of ill-fated. So now Pip War writes that column in RPS because she's much better at it.
So despite not being able to make money from being a games journalist, there's a lot of people writing about games. And you recently did a wonderful little collection where there's this kind of trope that people throw around where like, where's the X of Y? I mean, like, people, where's the Citizen Kane of video games? And people are like, where's the Lester Bangs,
Lester Bangs.
of games writing? Lester Bangs being the famous rock music critic who was
Yeah.
very, very literary and beautiful. And you said, you said, look at all these wonderful people writing about games, and you put together a collection of 8 or 9 wonderful pieces, which I thought was great. So, are you optimistic about the state of the art of games writing? Do you think it's actually in decent shape?
Yeah, I think it's like super healthy. Like there's so many every single day. Like there's like a new person that pops up on my radar that like they've written something amazing. Like Austin Walker wrote this incredible thing. Did you see that?
Oh, it's wonderful.
And it was about names,
About the Nemesis system,
NPCs and Nemesis system, and that was like an incredible article. And that's going on the list definitely.
Yes.
I need to update it.
Shout out to Austin Walker, that guy's amazing.
Yeah, really good article.
Yep.
And there's like a number like Maddie Myers is an incredible writer.
Yep.
I really like her a lot.
Yes.
There are like a ton of like amazing writers that are coming up, like men and women, like from all kinds of backgrounds. Like, I mean, I did make the list and then Patrick Miller was like, this is a really white list, and I was like, yeah, you're right, it is. So and it wasn't actually hard to like find people who are like writing about aspects of games that you never even thought about. So yeah, like I feel a lot like it's super healthy. I really like reading what other people have to say. And I feel like actually recently, Rock Paper Shotgun have been like poaching like the best writers from almost everywhere, and then just sort of having them turn up on the website. So that's really cool that they've gone out of their way to look more for that. So I feel like it's getting better and better and better, and like it's probably getting easier to be able to like pitch and like get known as well. The problem is like again like the economics of it are still bad. Like the freelance rates tend to be like, I think it's like America, like the average is like $200 at like the biggest publications for a feature, and over in the UK I think RPS pays about £150 for a freelance feature. So yeah, you have to be pitching all the time, and you have to really keep going, because otherwise like you don't have enough money to do anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something that is probably a hobby for people more often, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the audience, but before we do that, I want to ask one last question. Be kind of a devil's advocate a little bit, because I think part of this shift that we're seeing is towards a focus on individual creators and on their sort of the expressive capacity of games, and an interest in them as personalities. And I don't know, sometimes I think that one of the things that's nice about games is that there's less of that. You know what I mean? So let me see if I can put this the right way.
There's less celebrity culture.
Yeah, there's less the cult of personality, there's less of the auteur, there's less celebrity culture. And so, for example, in many art forms, there is the presence of this charismatic figure, whether it's the actor or the director.
Are you saying games people aren't charismatic?
I'm saying that that's not as much. Like I'm saying that there's a spectrum of cognitive personality types.
Yes.
And games are replete with many people for whom social interaction with the sort of like effortless charm of the actor, the persuasive conversation of the politician do not come naturally.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a strength of ours. You know what I mean? Like maybe we should be embracing that.
Yeah.
And so in the rush to become these charming personalities, I'm saying let's not lose sight of the sort of the awkwardness of the inventor or the scientist or the mathematician who makes games and isn't someone you would want to read about in Interview magazine.
Yeah, I mean, there's still that type. There's like a lot of that type of game maker around, and they still make really great games. I mean, like like there's. I bet you there's like, I mean, you don't know the name of everyone who works at Rockstar. I mean, they're not all like shy or anything, but like they wouldn't want to like have a microphone and say anything. I don't think they just want to have their work speak for itself. So, so yeah, like I feel like that, yeah, it's nice, as you say, to have like a culture where celebrity isn't as important. But the thing is, like, I feel like charismatic people in any kind of field will automatically come to the top as being like spokespeople. Like, I feel like Rami, for example, Rami Ismail, like, he is like really charismatic, and he actually has taken on the role of like being this kind of representative of the indie community, and I feel like that's really, really good for people who are shy and like who feel like they don't really want to say anything, and I actually like think it's like a really nice symbiosis that him and JW have going, where JW doesn't really have to say anything, because
Yeah.
like he's that part of Lambir that makes, and like Rami's like the business and the marketing and like the charisma. Although JW is very charismatic as well.
Yes.
But like the thing is like I guess like that's always going to be a thing in any field, is where people who want to talk and people who want to say things and people who want that role will automatically become spokespeople. Like I feel like
Yeah.
you know, Cliff Blazinski and Miyamoto and all these people, like they're the figureheads for a reason, because they do want that role. They want
Yeah.
it. So
And you're right, and I think one of the other things that I often think about is the responsibility, as games become more and more important, for people who make games to think, for at least some of them, to think about the role of the public intellectual,
Yeah.
the way that filmmakers and writers and other people do, where they can bring a perspective to bear on important contemporary topics through the lens
Yeah.
of the art they're making, and so that's,
and
yeah.
I also feel like we should get rid of the idea that gamers and game makers should be socially awkward
Mhm.
and like crappy at talking to people,
Yeah.
because that's not something that we should look up to. I feel like we need people to talk to each other, and I feel like there's a lot of that is actually kind of damaging to us as a community. I feel like we want to have kids that want to talk to each other about their problems, because I feel like as soon as they don't talk about their problems, like that's when people start to lash out, and I feel like that's the reason that we were all shit talking each other on IRCs, because we didn't know how to talk to each other properly as human beings, and that's something I learned over a period of time. And I did learn it, to be honest, by actually going out to the pub and talking to people I played games with, but that was a social event that I had to learn how to be okay with. And I feel like that's something that we should definitely improve on as a community.
Very nice. Well said. Well said. Let's open it up and see if there are any questions in the audience. Anyone have any comments or questions or feedback for Cara? Yes.
So this is not an incredibly specific question, but when you were talking about Giant Rumpus and the Punch the Custard game, the first thing that popped in my head was, I know galleries in Chelsea where that would not be out of place. That
Yeah.
sounds like really performance arty, and that sounds, so without getting too terribly, like, into explaining what I mean, because I think it's kind of obvious, do you think that there's a line between just interactive art and making a game? Because it seems like that becomes entwines, that's just sort of blending together, and I think it's really neat and it's really exciting. So do you think there's sort of a continuum, or do you think that there's kind of a point where this isn't really a game anymore, it's a social project, or it's an art form, I mean, it's some other piece of art?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of moving away from like this sort of hard definition of game these days more and more, which is kind of cool. Like we're just talking about Tale of Tales, who like really see their games as more kind of art installation type stuff, and they have like a lot more inspiration from actual fine art, say, in like galleries and museums. And I guess to a certain extent, like Wild Rumpus is more focused on the theatrical sort of elements of games, like the performance sort of based stuff. But yeah, like I feel like we are kind of like, with Holly Grammatio's work, for example, like she's really concerned with like parlor games and like the Victorian kind of parlor games, and like things that are more physical, where you don't even have to have like a screen or like objects to play with. It could literally just be like an idea of a game, and then you actually figure out between all of the people that are in attendance. So I feel like we are actually starting to get better at like moving away from things that have to have a screen, say, for example, like that. But yeah, no, I feel like it's getting more fluid, and we're losing a lot of like our definitions about what a game is and isn't, and that's kind of freeing, because it means like we can probably reach more people this way. Like people like my mother, for example, would probably be way more into games that Hollywood would that Hollywood introduce, rather than like anything like, I mean, I tried to get her to play Proteus, and she got sick. She got like motion sick, and like I was really frustrated with it. It was like, Mom, how could you get motion sick? It's just like a walking simulator. You're just walking around. You don't get motion sick when you're walking around. But like my mom was just like, nah, it's very nice looking, Cara. Like, just like should we just go and play Monopoly? And I'm like,
Yes.
speaking of motion sickness, have you embedded or talked with any developers who are working on virtual reality or Oculus sort of stuff, and how that's affecting their lives? Because I've never seen it myself. I'm betting they live inside of those guns for a lot of people, and that is depressing for men.
Well, I mean, so I actually was part of Little Loud with a super talented guy called Justin Lloyd, who at every opportunity will bring up the fact that he is a BAFTA-winning developer. But he's not that obnoxious, but I just wanted to bring that up to embarrass him. But like he primarily works with Oculus Rift, I think, these days, and like he's just so obsessed with technology and like leap motion and all of that stuff. And so I feel like he is pretty much my, like, I think he also works for Unity a lot as well. So like he's like kind of my insight into this. And like there is, like I feel like it is kind of a place where like motion sickness does happen quite a lot. I mean, I feel a bit motion sick when I play with the Oculus Rift. But yeah, there's like a lot of like little indie games, like experiments being done with Oculus Rift where it's just like a very small kind of environment and you get to explore it. And like, I think that's going to become more popular in the future, definitely. But I haven't actually embedded with anyone who's doing anything with Oculus Rift, although I could seek that out. So that's a good idea. Thanks.
Yes.
A couple questions on the same. What about people doing non-digital stuff? Is that sort of, it seems like everyone who's better at this has been a video game person?
Yeah.
Is that a function of economics or interest, combination of factors?
It's a combination of factors. I guess it's mainly because I know video game people, my network is bigger in that respect. But I did get a really amazing email from someone recently which suggested that I should go and see an MIT graduate who does like RPGs, like pen and paper RPGs, I think. And she lives just outside of Shanghai now. I can't remember what her name was. But basically, they said you should go and visit this woman in China because she's one of she's just this amazing RPG badass, and you would think that she's really interesting. And so I'm currently trying to find a contact for her because she seems like completely off the map. Like, I don't even know. It's like trying to find the Catamites. Do you guys know about the Catamites? Like, the Catamites is like a really obscure game maker who went to university with Terry Kavanagh, who made the Super Hexagon. And I keep trying to get Terry Kavanagh to give me his email address. And Terry's like, nah, I don't know it. And I'm like, I think you know it. But he lives in Estonia somewhere. And I just want to turn up at his door and see if you let me in, sort of thing. You know what I mean? So that might happen one day. You might just get like an embed with, which is just like I walked around in the cold for a month and then went home. But yeah, like that. Yeah, so I could totally. But anyway, so I have gone out of my way to try and find board game makers and pen and paper like RPG writers, but I haven't quite got around to that yet. The biggest problem is that video games are like huge. Like there's so much to cover. Like there's every single day I get emails from someone like, do you want to come and see my stuff? And like, you know, my video game, not like my stuff, but like, but like I get those too. But like, no, I don't. But yeah, like I feel like there's so much in the video game world to cover. Like it just, I guess I should start another board game project or something. I don't know.
I'm fascinated by whether there will be. So now we're starting to see scenes emerge in all over the world, in China and India, and for me personally, I'm curious about whether there's what the development scene in Africa is like. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you've ever encountered anyone from Africa who makes video games, or if that's an aspect I would love to see.
I think there's like a pretty big scene in Nigeria.
Really?
Yeah, I haven't looked into that yet, but I do have an open invitation to South Africa because there's a radio host that like regularly runs like a video game radio show out of South Africa. And he was like, if you ever want to come and stay with me and my family, you're quite welcome to. We could hook you up with some developers to write about. And I haven't taken him up on that yet, but like it seems like a kind of interesting idea. So yeah, I think there is dotted around the continent, but like I guess I haven't really looked into it so much. I guess one of the elements I have to worry about is like, I've traveled around a lot in my life throughout my 20s, and I feel like I've put myself in some dangerous situations before, and I feel like I've done the danger part of my life, and I don't really know if I want to put myself in that position again. And so a lot of this Embed With project is like, usually I have someone to vouch for whoever I'm staying with.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, and game developers are not the most dangerous people in the world or anything.
Right.
But
you're not interested in like a Vice pitch, you know, where you're like
No,
gonna go to
I-
yeah,
no, and like
Eastern Europe in some war-torn corner of like, right?
No,
Yeah.
and like, I mean, so there are lots of like places left, like, and there are loads of game makers who are working like in countries where there's civil wars, and like
Sure.
they still make them,
Yeah.
like I should go out my way to cover these things, and I will, but
But you're not planning to go to North Korea to
no, I'm not
figure out
planning
making
on
a
going.
StarCraft clone.
No. Although,
Yeah.
do you know, like, my friend Jake Edelstein wrote Tokyo Vice, which is like it's a book about the Yakuza, because he was a police reporter for the Tokyo Metropolitan Police for most of his life. And he wrote this book because he needed to get it published in the US, because basically this Yakuza boss was after him and was going to kill him. And he knew that if he got it published in the US, then if someone killed him, it would be an international incident. And so he was like, well, this is going to save me. So he published this book. So I met up with him when I was covering Ojiro. And to my surprise, he said to me, yeah, my first beat was like on this newspaper, the Yomiuri, and they put me on the video games. And I covered Thief and like Deus Ex and like all these classic PC games and stuff, and I played all these games. And I was like, so you covered video games and then you like covered the Yakuza. Like that's the way that your career went. And he was like, yeah, I guess it got somewhat more dangerous. And I'm like, yeah, it really did. Like virtual death and then actual death. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Trying to think how to phrase it. So I agree with what you said about there actually being quite a lot of good games writing. But you still look at, and not that this is the only metric by which to judge this, but you look at like major newspapers, and games are still in like the tech section and not in like the arts and culture section.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what do you think would have to happen in our culture for that turnover to really happen, right? Like, does the video game culture really have to do more, or because we're doing such a good job with writing and there's great indie game makers, and is it more just a matter of the mainstream culture just being able to finally see that, or maybe like the right critical mass of people who just can't see it just kind of dying off, or what?
So it's really interesting that you asked this, because so there are two things that I found. Well, actually, I mean, I write for The Guardian, and they used to put the Guardian Games blog on the culture section, on the website. For some reason, I think they kicked it out recently for some reason. But I think it's a lot to do with budget. Like what it is that people don't really want to read the culture section, and they really want to read the tech section because it's glamorous, right? So, and it's new, and like people, there's a high turnover of like just news in the tech section, but like the culture section, like the number of people who want to read about theater and all this other stuff, it's actually kind of small. And so the budget like is actually smaller over in the culture section. So they can actually pay writers more if they put you in the tech section.
Wow, that's so interesting.
I think that's the reason anyway. So like that's the reason I think that sometimes that happens. But so you should definitely go away and read my Embed With Tumblr, because there's like one, so I went to see Catherine Neal. Catherine Neal is responsible for making a video game called Escape from Woomera. And she got funding from the Australian Arts Council to do it, right? And they will not ever fund a video game ever again after Escape from Woomera. And the reason is it was so politically hot button that huge governmental arguments were spawned from this one video game, because it was basically about how people are mistreated, asylum seekers are mistreated in Australia. And they did loads of research, they employed like investigative journalists, they got loads of information from people who were actually imprisoned in these places as asylum seekers. And they made this mod, which was essentially like a Half-Life mod. And it got art, and because it got arts funding, and it was funded by the government, and it was basically hugely critical of government policies, it just, the whole, like, hell broke loose. And Catherine, she was at the time, she was working for Atari, and she couldn't say, like, she couldn't be on the list of people making this video game, because firstly it was a conflict, but secondly it was political. And Atari did not want anything to do with politics whatsoever, and they didn't want anyone, like, working on this. So anyway, the outcome of this was that, so people started to talk about, can video games talk about this issue and have it be, because the left wing in Australia said that it was insulting that a video game had approached this topic because it trivialized it. And the right said, this is embarrassing to Australia that we funded this game. And there was a huge, like, political argument broke out, and I asked Catherine what people thought, right? So there were all these news articles about it. I think it was 2003 on the internet. And in the comments section, she was saying, people were finally asking, are games art? Like, that was what needed to happen in order for this conversation to happen. She was like, I made this thing because I thought it was important, and I wanted to approach it from a different angle. But people were finally going, are games art? Like, people who'd never even heard of Half-Life or like mods or anything like that, they were having a giant argument with each other, and they were actually starting to talk about video games as if they were worth something. And Catherine was like, this is like my biggest achievement. Like, this is my biggest achievement, is that happened just because we tried to make that video game. Anyway, Catherine is a huge badass because she organized Free Play Festival in Australia. And because she was working for Atari, she actually was interviewed by someone on stage. And she was like hidden under like a hoodie or something at the back of the arena, typing in like text-to-speech answers for the questions. Like, she's an incredible badass. You have absolutely no idea. This woman, and she just lives in Paris now and just makes like these little games that have nothing to do with politics. But she had this immense career, basically disrupting almost all of the culture in Australia. So yeah, she's really great. But that's up on Embed with as well if you want to read it.
It's so interesting, this idea that we're in games, we're like, oh, how can we get more of that? You know, we're anxious about our status. I mean, everyone's always anxious about status.
Yeah.
We're very anxious about our status. How can we get more of that cultural juice? But you know, then the sort of gatekeepers of culture are thinking, how can we get some of that video game juice? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
There's this weird exchange happening. Like, we have something as important as status, which is something else, which is this energy, relevance, a kind of strange momentum, and I think that the really important question for me anyway is what's our responsibility for managing this thing that we have, like our the power that we have to compel attention and to make these things that are connecting with people really, really deeply. Are there any other questions? You've already asked a question. I'm going to skip over you. And we're going to get some. I'm going to make sure that I'm not skipping over anyone in the back. But yeah, right.
Are you making any more online games or anything of your own?
So I really want to make another game next year. I think it might be 3D. Stop coughing. But yeah, no, I want to make a very narrative-based game because I'm primarily a writer and that's what I'm good at. I just tell stories. So I think I want to make a game next year, but we'll see how that goes. I have an all-woman team who wants to make it as well, which is going to be exciting. But yeah, like, we're going to have to queue for the bathroom for a long time. like, but yeah, like I feel like I want to make more games, but I don't know. Like so what after Embed With is over, which I think probably might be in January. I need to find like an alternate income probably. So I'll probably have to think a little bit harder about this because I'll need to be able to fund making it. But I don't know, are you talking about Sacrilege? Did you like Sacrilege? Okay. So I made a game called Sacrilege, which is about sexy times. And it was in the New York Times this week. It's so exciting.
Which section was it in?
Oh. In the like definitely don't play this smut section. But yeah, like, but yeah. So anyway, I would like to make more, but I need to find time to do it. Basically, like in order to survive, I need to keep writing a lot like sharks swim. And if I stop swimming, then I'm probably out of any kind of way to eat. So I should probably keep writing. But I would love to make a game. I'll need to see if I can do more.
Well, I think we're going to let you go at this point. This has been amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation. I think your work is really important. And where can people go to read your work, to read the Embed project, and to support you? Where should they go?
Well, I can probably put it back up on the.
Put it back up on the projector.
But yeah, like I have a website that tries to sort of centralize all of my work, which is at Cara Ellison, all one word, .co.uk. Don't go to .com because it's a right-wing anon blogger who writes erotic fiction about the CIA. And I'm happy to take, I'm happy to take the kudos for that, but I feel like she would be mad with me, so.
But it's, yeah, I think the projector's off. So we're just going to say it verbally. I think it's off at the electrical machine part. That's all right. It'll take like an hour to warm up. So we're just going to say it verbally. It's caraellison.co.uk.
And you can find Embed With at Embed With, all one word, embedwith.tumblr.com because I'm grungy and lo-fi like that.
Nice.
And I'm also on Twitter. I just at Cara Ellison, so you can follow me there.
Fantastic.
Hello, and that you hated me and everything I stand for. No, don't say that.
Don't say that. Thank you. This was wonderful. I love Orbital. This has been a great conversation. Thank you. Put your hands together for Cara Ellison.